reason, it's very difficult for even very qualified buyers to buy homes, particularly in California, because of the nature of the down payment that's typically required now. So he did speak a little bit about that, he sort of set that general scene, but his greater point was that community organizations, people who work with first-time homeowners, can do a lot to help the homeowner strengthen their case for a loan, and can work with banks to help understand the peculiarities of these, particular borrowers who might be very, very strong, might have very focused FICO scores, and tick off most of the boxes, the key boxes for extending a loan in this environment, but may not actually have the full down payment, or maybe pulling that down payment from a variety of different sources that banks typically may not be familiar with. So generally, his presentation was much more of an exhortation to work very closely with your community bankers who are still in a position to extend loans, but have tightened up standards in a way that's understandable, and just work within those kinds of, those sort of new rules, but to still try to represent a good buyer as a good buyer and a responsible homeowner when that is in fact possible. So,
what was that gentleman's name again?
Stephen Blakely.
Stephen Blakely.
Yeah.
With measured outcomes, right out of Biotin, actually. One takeaway I think is for all of us to think about is financial literacy, education along these lines, and think about, as we move forward today, keeping that in the back of our minds, what was missing over the last few years when it came to dealing with responsible home ownership, right? And so what are some other things that we need to consider along those lines as we move forward?
The third presentation was one that I did. It was essentially a review of some potential housing policies that can be pursued in the Valley, and I will run through them very quickly, but we can have a richer conversation about that later. The primary strategies were really focusing on how to get renters and people who are not currently homeowners on the path to homeownership where that makes sense. So it doesn't make sense for everybody, but where it makes sense. So some of those strategies have to do with making sure that there is enough affordable rental housing, which I think is a pretty straightforward policy recommendation. Secondly, to try to look at some creative but responsible strategies for getting renters to eventually own the homes that they are in. So sort of lease-to-own, rent-to-own strategies that are somehow underpinned financially by a variety of sources. So they could be private sources, they could be some nonprofit sources that help sort of move the buyer along that path until he or she becomes, the potential buyer until he or she becomes an actual buyer. Some of the other strategies had to do with getting the kinds of mortgages that really will help low-income and moderate-income buyers get into the market, such as energy-efficient mortgages, the kinds of mortgages that really speak to the expenses that typically are unforeseen and can make homeownership difficult for this particular population. And then the last set of strategies had really to do with how we can work as a community and public and private partnerships to really see if there's a way to take REO properties and move them creatively so that they become available to people who actually need the housing and can afford the housing and can have shown themselves to be responsible homeowners. So that's sort of the range of strategies. We had a long sort of discussion about that, and we can do that again, but I just wanted to kind of give you a general overview because I want to make sure we have enough time to go forward. The last presentation was done by Felicity Lyons, and she, Coalition for Rural Housing, and she essentially spent a fair amount of time talking about inclusionary housing and some of the challenges associated with that, some of the recent court decisions, talked a little bit about generally what is being done in the San Joaquin Valley around inclusionary housing, some of the challenges, some of the potentials, and I really encourage you to take a look at her very, very excellent presentation to get a sense of everything that's going on. It's a very, very rich presentation, full with lots of data more you wanted to add about that?
No, I think a good presentation.
Okay, so this is just, I wanted to give you a sort of appetizer, and then sort of hope that you will go on our websites and take a look at the actual presentations. So with that, Daryl, you and I are up next. And what we're going to do now is we're going to recap some of the main recommendations that came out of that particular session. So let me...
If you have something you're gonna hand out to us that has, if you're covering, or is it all on your website?
we are going to, we have